At exactly 4:17 a.m. Washington time this morning, a decision was made inside the White House that could shatter one of the most stable alliances on Earth. President Donald Trump signed an emergency national economic order targeting Canada, triggering retaliatory trade measures that could hit more than $914 billion in cross-border industries within days. But the real shock came minutes later. Officials in Washington confirmed that key elements of NORAD intelligence coordination, the defense system protecting North America for over 65 years, may be partially suspended within 36 hours if Ottawa refuses to comply. This isn't a routine diplomatic dispute. It's the first visible crack in the strategic backbone of North America, and most mainstream networks are still hours behind the story. Before the narrative gets rewritten, subscribe right now, because the details emerging from Washington and Ottawa suggest a countdown has already begun, and the next 48 hours could redefine the balance of power on this continent. In the next 12 minutes, I'm going to break down the three hidden forces driving this crisis. First, the real trigger behind Washington's $914 billion economic retaliation, and why it was prepared weeks before anyone noticed. Second, the NORAD intelligence shock and how a 60-year defense partnership suddenly became a bargaining weapon overnight. And finally, at the end of this video, I'll reveal three possible scenarios that could unfold within the next 48 hours, including the one outcome that could permanently fracture the North American alliance. Stay with me, because the final scenario explains why this crisis may have been inevitable all along. To understand why this crisis erupted so suddenly, we have to step back and examine the sequence of events that built pressure beneath the surface for months. What happened at 4:17 a.m. did not come out of nowhere. In fact, according to multiple policy analysts in Washington, the confrontation between the United States and Canada has been quietly escalating through economic, energy, and security channels long before the public noticed. Let's break this down systematically. Evidence 1. The economic trigger. The first pressure point lies in the enormous economic machinery binding the United States and Canada together. Every year, roughly $914 billion worth of goods and energy products move across the border between the two countries. That includes aluminum, uranium, oil, hydropower, automotive components, and advanced semiconductor materials. But earlier this year, the Canadian government under Prime Minister Mark Carney introduced a sweeping plan to restructure the country's cross-border energy infrastructure. The proposal involved placing several strategic pipeline and energy transport networks under expanded federal supervision, a move Ottawa described as necessary for long-term energy security. From Washington's perspective, however, this looked very different. Several U.S. policy advisors argued that such restructuring could give Canada leverage over energy flows that power major American industrial regions in the Midwest and Northeast. When analysts inside the Department of Commerce began modeling potential disruptions, their projections showed that even a temporary supply restriction could ripple through industries worth more than $300 billion annually. That's when the alarm bells started ringing in Washington. According to a former U.S. trade negotiator interviewed by several policy forums, contingency measures had already been drafted weeks before the order was signed. In other words, the emergency action we saw at 4:17 a.m. may not have been spontaneous at all. It may have been the final step of a plan already sitting on the president's desk. And if you're starting to see how serious this situation is becoming, hit the like button right now, because what comes next moves beyond economics into something far more dangerous. Evidence 2. The NORAD pressure point. For more than 6 decades, the backbone of North American security has been a joint defense command called NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command. Established during the Cold War, NORAD allows the United States and Canada to share radar networks, satellite tracking, and early warning systems designed to detect incoming threats. In practical terms, NORAD represents one of the deepest military partnerships anywhere in the world. That's why the announcement that certain intelligence sharing mechanisms could be temporarily suspended within 36 hours shocked defense analysts across multiple countries. Retired U.S. Air Force General Philip Breedlove, who previously served as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe, warned in a recent policy discussion that weakening NORAD cooperation, even partially, could create what he described as a strategic blind spot over North America. His concern is straightforward. NORAD operates as an integrated detection network. If one part of the system begins withholding intelligence data, the overall response time to potential threats could slow dramatically. Defense planners hate uncertainty, and uncertainty is exactly what this decision introduces. Now here's where things become even more complicated, because intelligence analysts suggest that the NORAD pressure tactic might not be purely about defense. Instead, it may be designed as a powerful negotiation signal aimed directly at Ottawa. By tying economic retaliation with military coordination, Washington effectively links two pillars of the bilateral relationship: trade and security. That dramatically raises the stakes. Evidence 3. The market shockwave. Whenever geopolitical tensions escalate between two major economies, financial markets react quickly. And this situation is no exception. Within hours of reports about the emergency order circulating through policy circles, market strategists began modeling the potential consequences. According to several financial analysts, if trade flows between the United States and Canada were significantly disrupted, the combined economic shock could temporarily affect over $2 trillion in North American supply chains. That number isn't speculation. It reflects the interconnected industries that rely on seamless cross-border movement. Energy companies in Alberta supply crude and natural gas to American refineries. Automotive factories in Ontario ship components to Michigan assembly lines. Aluminum smelters in Quebec feed production chains stretching across multiple U.S. states. Disrupt any part of that system, and the ripple spreads quickly. Even prominent investors have begun weighing in. During a recent interview discussing geopolitical risk, Warren Buffett warned that modern supply chains operate like a delicate network. As he put it, when major trading partners start using economic pressure against each other, markets don't wait for clarity, they react instantly. That's precisely the concern facing financial institutions right now, because uncertainty itself can move markets. Evidence 4. The strategic calculations. At this point, the question many observers are asking is simple. Why escalate now? One possible explanation lies in political timing. Governments often take decisive action when they believe their leverage is strongest. If Washington believes Canada's economic strategy could reshape North American energy flows in the long term, applying pressure early might appear advantageous. From Ottawa's perspective, however, backing down immediately could carry its own risks. Prime Minister Mark Carney built much of his international reputation as a financial strategist capable of managing complex economic transitions. Yielding too quickly in a confrontation with Washington could undermine the credibility of Canada's broader policy agenda. So both sides face a difficult calculation. Escalate, and the economic consequences could spread quickly. Back down, and political credibility may suffer. This is why analysts increasingly describe the situation as a strategic standoff rather than a simple trade dispute. And that's the critical point most headlines are still missing. Because when economic pressure, defense coordination, and political credibility all collide at once, the outcome becomes far less predictable. If you're beginning to understand why this story matters far beyond North America, press like now so this analysis reaches more people who want the full picture. Because the real question isn't just what happened at 4:17 a.m. The real question is, what happens next? And when we look ahead to the next 48 hours, the possibilities become even more dramatic. Now we arrive at the critical moment in this story, the next 48 hours. Because when two deeply interconnected nations suddenly collide over economics, defense coordination, and political credibility, events rarely stay contained for long. Analysts in Washington, Ottawa, and several European capitals are now quietly modeling what could happen if the current standoff continues. And according to multiple strategic forecasts, the crisis is likely to move toward one of three possible scenarios. Scenario 1. Full de-escalation. In the first scenario, both governments quietly step back from the brink. Behind closed doors, negotiators from Washington and Ottawa could reach a temporary agreement that allows both sides to claim a political victory. Canada might agree to adjust parts of its energy restructuring framework, while the United States could soften or delay the most aggressive components of its economic retaliation package. If that happens, the $914 billion cross-border trade system continues operating with minimal disruption. NORAD coordination remains intact. Markets stabilize. From a political standpoint, both leaders would present the outcome as proof that strong leadership forced the other side to reconsider its position. But this scenario requires something difficult: mutual compromise within a very short time window. And right now, that window is shrinking quickly. Scenario 2. Controlled economic pressure. The second scenario is far more likely, according to several geopolitical analysts. In this outcome, the United States proceeds with targeted economic pressure, selectively imposing tariffs or regulatory restrictions on specific Canadian exports, such as aluminum, energy products, or strategic minerals. Canada responds with limited countermeasures, but both governments intentionally avoid actions that would fully collapse the economic relationship. In other words, a managed confrontation. Trade slows. Certain industries feel the pressure. Political tensions remain high. But the overall system survives. This kind of economic chess match can last months or even years, and while it avoids immediate disaster, it slowly reshapes the balance of leverage between the two countries. Scenario 3. Strategic rupture. The third scenario is the one that concerns defense planners the most. If negotiations collapse and both sides escalate simultaneously, the crisis could move beyond economics into something far more serious: a strategic rupture in the North American alliance. Imagine the consequences for a moment. Expanded trade restrictions begin disrupting supply chains worth over $2 trillion. Energy flows across the border slow dramatically. Political rhetoric intensifies. Then the most sensitive issue enters the equation: military coordination. Even a partial breakdown in NORAD cooperation would send shockwaves through global security institutions. NATO allies would immediately demand emergency consultations. Financial markets could react with extreme volatility. Because for more than half a century, the US-Canada partnership has been viewed as one of the most stable relationships in international politics. If that foundation cracks, the message to the world would be unmistakable. Even the strongest alliances are not immune to strategic conflict. And that is why the next 48 hours may determine whether this story becomes a short-lived diplomatic confrontation or the beginning of something far more disruptive. So here's where things stand right now. A decision made at 4:17 a.m. in Washington has triggered a chain reaction that could reshape one of the most stable alliances in modern history. A potential $914 billion economic confrontation, pressure on the NORAD defense partnership, and a political standoff between President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Mark Carney have pushed the United States and Canada into a moment few analysts believed possible. The clock is now ticking on the next 48 hours. Either both sides step back from the edge, or the first real fracture in the North American alliance could begin to form. But here's the question that matters most. Has Washington pushed too far, Or did Ottawa miscalculate the consequences of its strategy? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read every perspective. And if you want to stay ahead of stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next development in this crisis could arrive at any moment.